Neurofeedback is being heralded as a non-invasive, medicine-free option for a multitude of conditions, including anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and attention deficit disorder, just to name a few. Joining us now to tell us more about the promise of these treatments in Asheville, North Carolina, via Skype, Ed Hamlin. He's clinical director at the Institute for Applied Neuroscience. And with us here in the studio, Linda Thompson, director of the AD Center. That's not the ADD Center, right? The AD Center and the Biofeedback Institute of Toronto. And it's great to have both of you with us on the program today. Let's just start with some definitions here, Ed, because I suspect a lot of people won't know what we're talking about. Neurofeedback, what is it?
Neurofeedback is a form of biofeedback where the EEG is the signal that's being fed back to the individual for them to learn to be able to change their brain activity.
And you've done some work with, for example, abused kids on neurofeedback. Give us an example of what you've been doing.
Well, one of the things with children who have early abuse, neglect, and trauma, they have a different brain development than most people who would have adequate parenting. So their brains are often selectively evolved for and developed for survival. That works well if you're in a dangerous or threatening situation, not so well if you're in the classroom trying to learn the things that would come across in reading, writing, arithmetic. And so we've learned that these difference in patterns can be altered through training them, along with comprehensive treatment. It doesn't stand alone as a treatment for abuse or neglect, but it's certainly an effective strategy to help make the other approaches that you're using more effective.
Okay, Linda, I made the distinction between the name of your center, which is the AD, as opposed to the work you do with ADD, which is attention deficit disorder. Neurofeedback, what does it do for kids with ADD?
Well, it lets them learn self-regulation skills. So they manage the symptoms of ADD, and also it brings out their inner motivation, because often these children, especially as they get older and discouraged by their experiences, are not very interested in school. But specifically, I mean, we published, because I was a psychologist, because I was skeptical about this 20 years ago, I actually measured pre and post interventions. So what it does for them, published back in 1998, is 12-point increase in IQ on average, improvement in reading, spelling, and math, decrease in symptoms of ADHD. So a pretty comprehensive result.
You like the success rate of that?
I do. Right.
Tell me about Matt, 15 years old, guy you worked with. What happened?
We are speaking of someone who was cited in the ADD book.
Yep.
So it just can transform their life once they can pay attention. Because typically these are bright kids, but they underachieve in school because school is the farmer's world. They pay attention like hunters.
What'd you do for them?
Well, we did 40 hours of training, which is what we do with all our clients. Some actually take longer if they're more complicated, if they are on the autism spectrum or some things like that. And then they get a combination of the biofeedback, neurofeedback, and strategies. So also using their calm focus that they practice with the computerized feedback gives you a teachable moment for training them in other areas.
And one more follow-up. Can you just give us an idea about the nature of the exercises and the training that you do with them?
Well, we call it exercise for the brain. So you are monitoring brain waves. When the brainwave pattern shows that the person is calm and focused, then a game works. So it's nice, simple, fun, display audio and visual feedback, and then they know that their brain's doing the right thing. So they finally learn what it feels like to pay attention.
And Ed, what's the trick to getting somebody into that calm, focused place? How do you do that?
Well, the feedback is actually a major part of that. It works like the speedometer would on your automobile. Without the speedometer, it would be difficult to know if you were going too fast or maybe if you were slowing down and going too slow. But with the speedometer, you know that it gives you an immediate feedback signal about whether or not you're increasing your speed or decreasing your speed. So the feedback does the same thing for the person to know that the activity in their brain is speeding up too much or slowing down too much. And so it helps them be able to get into the range where they have the calm focus.
And what kind of success rates are you having?
The success rates are really very, very good. I went into this, much like Linda was saying, I went into this as a complete skeptic. Was very impressed with the additional benefit because we were already practicing, had clinical practice, we're already working with these populations. The increase in outcomes is what really made us switch over to essentially being a neurofeedback-based practice now. Instead of it being something that we add on to the treatment, it really is the center part of the treatment.
Linda, I don't think this is widely known. There are other treatments that have a lot more attention and space sort of in the public's mind than this one. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
Well, the most widely used intervention for attention deficit disorder is medication.
Right.
And in the US, they have 3.5 million children taking medication. So there is a profit motive for drug companies to create this industry around ADHD and have more children taking medication. And medications have a positive response rate of about 75%, though sometimes you'll have to try different meds to find one they respond to. Neurofeedback, on the other hand, has a success rate that's above 90%. If you should do it carefully, but if you do, and if they train long enough, it actually has a higher success rate. And the other advantage is, well, no negative side effects, and your results last. So there have been follow-ups, 10-year follow-up published in 1995, a very rigorous 2-year follow-up done in Europe, published more recently, that show that once you've trained the brain and it's made a shift towards a more mature pattern, those results last.
Ed, can I get your view on whether you think there's an interest by Big Pharma in keeping this quiet so that they can make greater profits?
I'm not sure they're doing much to actively squelch it. I think it's more that they have the means to be able to publicize. There's a lot of money spent to advertise medications. In fact, there's more money spent to advertise them than there is to develop them. So the educational programs that are done in professional settings are often supported by the pharmaceutical companies. So it's really, I think it's much more through the promotion of the drugs, and we really don't have the means of doing that with neurofeedback. We don't have the money to be able to do the type of marketing and educational programming that they do.
Well, speaking of money, we have some sense about how much it costs to put a child on whatever drug is required to deal with ADD or ADHD for an extended period of time. How would you compare that to the costs of doing neurofeedback?
Well, the studies that have been done show neurofeedback actually ends up being cheaper because the medicine only works while it's in your system. The brain doesn't learn anything from taking the medicine, different from neurofeedback. And as Linda was pointing out, the results from the neurofeedback tend to be there in one study at least for 10 years later. So there's no reason to assume that 15 or 20 years would make a difference if they're there 10 years later. And the medicine works while it's in your system. And then when it's out of your system, your brain is in exactly the same state as it was before you took the medicine. So there's really no change that occurs. So if the medication benefits, in order to maintain the benefits, you have to continue to take the medication, which of course makes the cost much higher in the long run.
Ironically, I mean, we've heard in other examples on the program, a lower cost may actually derive less buy-in. We've seen that with some other things. Has that been part of the difficulty here as well, Linda, you think? Because it's cheaper and therefore a bit more of an impediment to its acceptance?
Well, sometimes the high-tech toys have a little more cachet to them. So for example, there was a conference, a brain science conference here in Toronto, and they had a talk on neurofeedback. But they didn't have the talk given by someone who does the regular neurofeedback that's inexpensive using EEG monitoring. They had someone from Wales who does fMRI neurofeedback. So you're using $1 million machine that costs about $2,000 every scan to do your feedback, and that was highlighted. So, which is fine, because if you can do it in the high-tech way and show success, then to me it's common sense that you might use the less expensive equipment, you know, $10,000 equipment rather than $1 million equipment to derive the same results.
I don't get it, because we're spending $50 billion a year on healthcare in Ontario, and apparently we are always searching for equally effective but cheaper ways to treat people.
Right.
This sounds like it's a more effective, cheaper way to treat people, and yet it's not in the spotlight the way some of the other treatments are.
Right.
How come?
Well, I do think in the 21st century that biofeedback will finally come into its own, because it is cost effective and the results can last. So it makes sense. So initially you've got an upfront cost, and it's not a quick fix, right? So you have to train the brain. We do 40 sessions of training. Takes about 5 months. They come twice a week. So you have to be willing to let the brain change and wait for those effects, as opposed to medications where you will see the results within an hour.
I wonder, Ed, if that's not part of the problem, is that we're in a bit of a culture nowadays where when something goes wrong, find me a pill, tomorrow I'll start taking it, and then it's done.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think that, as Linda was pointing out, I think we're seeing that begin to transition, though. Where we haven't had much interest in the past in neurofeedback in major research universities, at least in the U.S., we are beginning to see a greater interest in it. I think some of the limitations of medication are being recognized, and some of the risk of medications are being recognized. The longest publicly funded study that's been done on ADHD, looking at medication, has found that the benefits of the medication really are not permanent, that after a couple of years there's really not much difference in the children who are medicated and the children who weren't medicated. That hasn't been the case with neurofeedback. So I do think there's a growing awareness of alternatives and self-regulation approaches that neurofeedback is going to be in a good position to get more exposure than it has.
And Ed, let me ask this follow-up, which is, so far we've been talking about people with problems using neurofeedback.
Right.
And I wonder whether or not you think people with perfectly healthy brains, whether this is an option for them for improving cognition and other brain-related issues.
Certainly, there's a whole subset of folks in neurofeedback who do peak performance training or optimizing brain functioning, because most of us are not optimizing our brain functioning. A lot of that has to do with the demands that we face now are so much higher, and the demands on our attention. What used to be sufficient attention to function quite well is being taxed now just by the number of things impinging on our attention. So most people could benefit from improved self-regulation and certainly focus training.
Well, let me ask you, Linda, to give an example of somebody who, well, he's forever going to go down in the history of this country as a legend, because he was the first Canadian ever to win a gold medal at the Olympics on home soil for Canada, and that's Alexandre Bilodeau, the freestyle skier. What was he doing with neurofeedback that I guess you say helped him?
Well, before the last Winter Olympics in Vancouver, there were 2 groups of Canadian athletes who got neurofeedback and biofeedback training. One was the freestyle skiers, including Alexandre Bilodeau, and the other were the short track speed skaters. And they both did very well at the Games.
You think there's a connection?
And, well, after the Games, then it was revealed that this had been part of the Own the Podium program. And he was quoted in Maclean's magazine as saying that this training decreased his tension and improved his focus. And that's what we want for the athletes. It's also what we want for those kids with ADHD or for executives who want to optimize performance. So what made me so happy about that becoming public was that it made it such a respectable intervention. So kids didn't have to think they were doing this brain exercise because there was something wrong with them. And I can often say to children, you know, we'll see who notices the improvements first. It might be your coach, it might be your teacher. So I love the fact that it's being used for optimal performance. But I should say that in terms of evidence-based, there is research that makes this accepted as an efficacious treatment for only 2 conditions. And those 2 conditions are ADHD and epilepsy.
Not moguls.
So, not moguls. All the other applications, optimal performance, depression, treating anxiety. Well, anxiety biofeedback does have efficacy established, but the neurofeedback, it's really considered experimental, except for epilepsy and ADHD.
Okay. Do you know
but for ADHD, even the American Pediatric Association has given it level 1 efficacy for interventions for ADHD.
Level 1 presuming the best.
The best, the same level as they give medications. And that was just in November 2012 when they did their latest review. So finally the research was strong enough that they gave it that highest level of efficacy. And interestingly, most of that research has come from outside the US. It's Canadian, European, as well as American. But
do you know whether the, I mean, we've got an Olympics happening again in next month.
Yes.
Do you know if the Canadian Olympic team is still using this?
I was just actually checking this out, and last time it was only those people who were training in Quebec, north of Montreal, who had the training. This year there are also people in Calgary doing the training. And the US Olympic centers have neurofeedback and biofeedback.
Interesting. Yeah. Ed, neurofeedback, do you think it's going to be part of the future of optimizing human intelligence and brain capability?
I definitely think it is. The technology is developing very rapidly at this point. And so I think that, as Linda was talking about, sometimes the number of sessions involved have been an impediment to some people getting involved. I think as the technology improves, we may be able to reduce the number of sessions involved in this. So there's more development that's happening probably in the last 6 to 8 years as compared to 30 years prior to that.
But here's the thing, Ed, if there suddenly becomes an uptick in interest in this, does your world have the infrastructure to provide the service?
We're almost behind now, as the interest in the last 5 years has expanded. It's been hard to get enough trained people. One of the problems is that, at least in the U.S., is I think the threshold for entry into doing this is relatively low. There's not really a licensing body for it, and so there are many people who've acquired equipment that are training people without really the kind of knowledge or expertise that would be necessary to be able to do it. So I think that risk is quite real, that there will be more people offering the service than there are qualified people to provide it.
And that presumably, Linda, is going to be problematic for those of you who want this recognized as a legitimate means of improvement.
But I think higher demand is a problem we would like to face because it makes so much sense and it's so gratifying to help people learn self-regulation skills. Because biofeedback, when they were first naming it, the runner-up for the name was self-regulation. And to be able to self-regulate your emotions, to be able to self-regulate your attention, has huge potential for virtually all of us.
Just finally, let me ask you a question about the media, because of course media have the potential to explain things and clarify. They also have the potential to sensationalize and take people off in wildly different directions. How have, in your view, how have media reported on or analyzed or tried to explain this whole phenomenon?
In Montreal, there were no neurofeedback practitioners a few years ago. And then there was an article in L'Enfant magazine, which is like the parents' magazine in Quebec, and it reported on a study done in Montreal where they actually used fMRI and showed that there were changes in brain activation after neurofeedback training. And the article was written by the mother of one of the children in the study. And she wrote this passionate article about treating the ADHD without medications. And then there were 400 phone calls to the university.
Right? From that one article.
From that one article. And now there are about 6 centers in Montreal. So once there was the grassroots demand, then the service is popped up.
Followed. We hope we have added to the responsible media coverage of this phenomenon, and I want to thank both of you for coming on the program tonight and helping us out with it. In Asheville, North Carolina, Ed Hamlin, the clinical director of the Institute for Applied Neuroscience, and Linda Thompson, director of the AD Center and the Biofeedback Institute of Toronto. Good to meet both of you on TVO tonight. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Steve.